be here, Smitty and everyone. Thank you so much for having me. So it's quite late over here, as some of you will know. This is 11 o'clock at night. It is the record for me. I've never given a lecture as late as this, but fortunately I'm a night owl. It's also good that I'm starting this late because I've actually had some new data in this afternoon, which I'm going to use in this lecture. So, you know, you can't do better than that, really. So, yes, just to orientate everybody, Blick Mead is a spring that's about, well, it's a couple of miles to the west of, excuse me, to the east of Stonehenge. And it's a site that is used across the Mesolithic. So the Mesolithic is the Middle Stone Age in Great Britain. It's the period of time that happens after the Ice Age, or after the last Ice Age, when people are recolonizing Britain from around 9000 BC. And estimates before Blick Mead were that the entire population of Great Britain and Ireland wouldn't have been more than about 5,000 people at this time. But so that's one of the special things about the site, that actually it's completely breaking down some of the shibboleths that we've had about what Mesolithic people do, and indeed how many people there might have been. But this is especially significant because we're right in the footprint of Stonehenge, and as people listening to this will know, one of the major questions about Stonehenge is, why is it there? And this may well be a new way of understanding why the stones were put where they are. So let me get cracking straight away with this. Let me, again, thinking about orientating you, get you into this really lovely illustration of the landscape around Stonehenge. You see Stonehenge in the center of the slide, and the avenue leading to it, the enigmatic Cursus monuments running broadly east-west, and Durrington Walls up in the right-hand corner. Now, if I start with Durrington Walls is the setting where almost certainly the people that built the last phase of Stonehenge lived. So they were living there around 2500 BC. The Cursus, though, is significantly older than Durrington Walls. It dates to around 3500 BC, so a full 1000 years before. And Stonehenge itself first gets constructed around 3000 BC and is still being constructed, and you know, probably hits the acme of its you know, the complete fluorescence of its specialness about 500 years later in 2500 BC. The avenue is a little bit later and takes you down to Blue Stonehenge down by the River Avon, which is a little bit earlier. Now, the point I'm making, everybody, is to say that we're not looking here at a landscape that was just full of Neolithic or New Stonehenge buildings that go up type of all at once, or monuments that go up all at once in a short period of time. The fact that the Cursus is there a good 1000 years before the Sarsens are erected at Stonehenge shows that there are very long memories in this landscape. And if you look across to where Blick Mead is, right centre of the slide, then we're potentially taking this story a lot further back. And as you'll see, this is really exciting. It's involved new science, cutting edge science, and it's also bringing in some good ethnographic understandings of how hunter-gatherers have worked elsewhere in the world. So I'm really excited to show you the very latest findings about the site and how they relate to Stonehenge, as Smitty said in his presentation earlier. So let's just give you a fix as to where Stonehenge is in relation to Blick Mead. You can see that Stonehenge here is in the right-hand corner, and Blick Mead is under the wooded canopy just right to the top left-hand corner of the picture. So it's just on the edge of Salisbury Plain, but it's in the river valley. So arguably in a position where it was much more likely that people lived. Stonehenge, for those of you who've been there, and for those of you who haven't, is right at the top of the plain. It's really exposed to the elements. It's in winter, it's absolutely brutal being there because of the whipping wind that comes in from the southwest. But down by the river valley, things would have been altogether warmer. Now, just at this point, I'd like to stop myself and just check in with Smitty to make sure that my sound is carrying across to everybody. Smitty, can you just let me know, are you hearing me and seeing the slides okay?
Everything is good. Everything is good.
Marvelous. Thank you very much. Well, I'll continue. Thank you very much. So central question is, well, not just for those of you listening tonight, but in general, is why on earth is Blick Mead a new discovery? Because, you know, people have been looking in the World Heritage Site of Stonehenge for 200 years. We've had the most eminent archaeologists in Britain and in Europe scouring the place for signs of something new. And yet Blick Mead was actually only found properly just about 10 years ago and is revealing more and more of its secrets, even as recently as 10 days ago when I was last there doing field work. Now, one of the answers to that is that originally Blick Mead, when I say originally, in the 18th century, at the time of this illustration, Blick Mead was part of a aristocratic landscape garden. And this landscaping has frankly type of hoodwinked British archaeologists for those 200 years, because people have just assumed that the landscaping that the aristocrats put in destroyed any underlying archaeology in the area. You can see where Blick Mead is on this 1776 map. I thought you'd appreciate the date being Americans. This 1776 map, Blick Mead is where the blue X is in the top right-hand corner of the slide. Now, why did I want to defy the received wisdom and start digging there? Well, I was interested when I was a postgrad at Cambridge, which I got that opportunity really as a result of having a Fulbright to Florida 25 years ago. So I've got an awful lot to thank Florida for. When I was a postgrad at Cambridge, my focus about this landscape wasn't the stones, it wasn't the upstanding monuments. What I was interested in was where the accessible water is. That was something actually that no one had really focused on. And I was actually interested in the accessible water in terms of animals, actually, rather than people, because, well, animals first anyway, because I thought, well, actually, where there's type of a stable water source that's accessible, you're going to get large herbivores and people will follow. So my reading of the estate records, the aristocrats' estate records, was that there was a spring line running into the area where you can see the blue X on that map. Now, that had been written up, that spring line, as being part of 18th century landscaping that people have put ponds in. But as you'll see, people couldn't have got that more wrong in terms of the time depth. So here is that area. This is a photograph taken a couple of years ago in December, round about the time of the winter solstice, just slightly before it. The site is really type of completely gone to nature. But I thought that you'd be interested to see this picture because it gives a clue as to why it would have been important for animals and people going all the way back into the Middle Mesolithic. And let me just give you a date range for the Mesolithic. In the UK, the Mesolithic starts around 9000 BC and it was said to fade out around 4500 BC. So it's actually the longest running sort of successful Homo sapien culture that we've ever had the hunter-gatherer one. But anyway, let me just come back from that caveat and go back to this picture. There's a clue, actually. If we were having a face-to-face lecture, I would have involved you here. What you can see in the picture that might be encouraging for animals. But what I'll point what is encouraging animals throughout, and that is the fact that you have got accessible water, even though the outside conditions here were -10. And I'm hoping that picture quality is coming through on your computer so that you can see there's actually grass growing underneath the water in places. And of course, this is in a Salisbury Plain is pretty high up above sea level. And in an area where there isn't a lot of water, apart from what would have been a very fast moving and quite dangerous river at the time, the River Avon, accessible water sources like this would have been really important and would have been a magnet for animals. And of course, people in the Mesolithic are at least as clever as us, you know, in terms of vocabulary, cognitive abilities, at least as smart, partly because they had to be more resourceful than most of us are. And they would have certainly understood that animals were here, and they probably would have, in effect, been doing some type of proto-husbandry by encouraging animals down here so that they could hunt them. So all well and good, folks, but I can tell you something about the British system in confidence, that if you are planning to dig in a place that literally everybody has been saying for a couple of 100 years has got no archaeology in it, and is at the latest 18th century, at the earliest 18th century, you don't get a grant. And then you compound the problems by being the first archaeological team in the UK to dig into a spring or a pond. And so, you know, you're going to be needing water pumps. So I just wanted to explain some of the difficulties we had first off. The university I was working for in 2005, the Open University, enabled me to take students down for 1 weekend a year to the site. And we were given a £500 budget, and that didn't cover anything. So at the time, what we were doing was slopping out trenches with buckets and spades. And we didn't know, and you can see this in this picture, we didn't know, where you can see the bright band of chalk, everybody, at the top, just under the topsoil. We didn't know that the aristocrat had allowed the roadworks from the road that was being built in the 1960s to be dumped over the spring. So that white line of chalk is actually not from the site, but is being dumped from elsewhere. So we had to dig through that. And for the first few weekends over the first few years, that's as far as we got. This picture was taken in 2009, which was the first time that I was able to get money from the local community to put in a water pump. And as soon as we were able to go down below 60 meters, we hit really fantastic archaeology. So that's essentially what we can see here in this top picture is the white line again is the chalk dump from the road building. And then you get lots of very slowly type of developing organic material, which would have been underwater. And between those black lines, everybody, it's about 20 centimeters thick. It's absolutely rammed with Middle Stone Age archaeology. Animal bones, beautiful flint tools like the one you can see in the photograph. Razor sharp, many of them. They hadn't moved very far, and they seem to have been deposited in the spring. Now, from this point, the local community at Amesbury properly kicked in. Amesbury is a garrison town, so lots of British Army soldiers at one time or another have lived there. It's a working class town, and it's been a town, frankly, that's been bypassed by a lot of archaeologists who would rather go to rather chintzy places like Salisbury with its lovely cathedral, which is 8 miles downstream, to show their finds off there. But the local town council, I really wanted to give a shout out to them. were phenomenally supportive of what we were doing, partly because they'd seen that we had really got the enthusiasm of a lot of local people, all of whom, well, all of the people in this picture anyway, are from Amesbury. And the town built these sieves. You might know that if you're excavating in a World Heritage Site, you have to go through 100% of the material. So we dug material out, put it in buckets, and then that material was put through a 5mm mesh and then a 2mm mesh, and then picked through literally with a tooth comb to see if there was anything that had been missing. So this is a lovely example here, everyone, of almost like a living symbol of town and gown, where a local community can really get behind a university project and completely catapult it into the big time. So I want to give you an idea of the type of density of finds. We've still, although we started in 2005, we've still only dug the size of a soccer penalty area in total. But we have absolutely hit the jackpot in terms of the archaeology. So you can see where trench 19 is. This is the bottom, the bottom left-hand corner. That we've got over 23,000 flint tools dating to the Mesolithic. A stonking great 57 kilograms of burnt flint. So signs of a lot of fire going on here, not just little discrete halves, but major fires, and I'll explain why that is in a minute. And with the green bubble, really strikingly, bearing in mind the antiquity of the Mesolithic, we're talking about, you know, material in some cases that's over 10,000 years old, well over 2,000 animal bone fragments. And you know, this is phenomenal because, and I should say as well, just to go into the detail about the flint tools, really exquisitely made tools which cover the whole of the chronology of the British Mesolithic, from the obliquely truncated points, which are very early, just after the Ice Age, through to crescents and rods, which are very late Mesolithic, from the 5th millennium BC. So it was immediately a sign, everyone, that we were finding something very unusual, that potentially people have been coming to the spring over an incredibly long period of time. As I say, the animal bones were really something you sort of get a sense from the photograph of volunteers, and you know, so one of our senior archaeologists, Tom, in the white hat, but the two guys behind him are volunteers. This sort of astonishment that you could be finding animal bones so well preserved. The picture on the right is from a wild cow called an Aurochs, and it still has a flint tool in its ankle. So, you know, this stuff had not moved far, if it moved at all, for all of those thousands of years. Now, although I'm from the University of Buckingham, such is the type of exponential growth of the project that I think, wisely involved experts from leading universities in the UK, such as Durham University, who are terrific at ancient animal bones. And what Durham did was quantify the bones, the animals that we found. And what they found was about 60% of our animal bone assemblage was from Aurochs, from these wild cows. And that's really interesting because these things would be about 3 times the size of an average US or UK cow now, 3 times the size, predicted running speed of about 35 miles an hour. And if you got a big bull down, you've got feeding there for about 300 people. And these were wasteful people, these hunter-gatherers. So there was a clue there. The fact that we got, I should say this is in terms of the whole of Europe, this is by far the biggest percentage ever found of people consuming Aurochs. So it gave us a clue here that Blick Mead might have been not a normal Mesolithic place. It may well have been like a hub point where people were coming in from miles and miles around to feast, and you know, everybody take part in a big hunt and a big meal afterwards. But it's not just about aurochs. You can see from the pie chart, people are also eating red deer, roe deer, wild pig, maybe some elk. In terms of fish bones, we've got evidence from salmon and trout, pike. So what we've got here really is a snapshot, especially as some of these animals are seasonal. We've got a snapshot here that potentially people were at Blick Mead pretty much all year round. Now, let me just put this into perspective, everybody, and this is really important. So in 200 years of looking in the World Heritage Site, you've got the map of it here, the total number of Mesolithic finds were about 30. That's right across the World Heritage Site. Now, at the moment, we have got over 100,000 flint tools and pieces of work flint alone, and we've got about 5,000 animal bones as well. So I think it's interesting to contrast this with Professor Tim Darville's type of almost statement position about the chances of finding anything Mesolithic in this landscape, only written in 2006. And the quote is at the corner of the map when Darville says, "Little can be said about either the technological or cultural relationships of the 7th to 5th millennium BC material around Stonehenge, as there is simply not enough of it to judge." Simply not enough of it to judge. Well, as I say, we have now got plenty of it to judge, an enormous amount. And so, yes, we've got the tools, and of course they're fascinating because they're showing us what people are doing. And these are not just tools for killing animals. We've got certain types of tools which are used for making clothing, for making holes in clothing, for cleaning sinew, a whole range of tasks. But with the animal bone that we've got, the animal bone is particularly important because we can apply cutting edge science to it. Plus, it provides samples for carbon dating, and the animal bone also gives us clues as to how people were living. So let me give you an example of cutting edge science. Durham University used isotopic analysis methodology to analyze where a particular couple of aurochs that we found, the teeth that we found from the site, from 2 different aurochs, where they came from, what their habits were, and what they were eating. And what we found was, or what they found was, that both of these aurochs were local, that they astonishing result that they worked out that they were living on the plain for most of the time, but in winter came back into woodlands. They could tell that from the signature of bark, which was still present in the enamel of the teeth. And so what this did was it underscored the fact that there are a lot of aurochs in the neighborhood. You might think that's obvious that from the animal bones being there, but we couldn't be sure until this point exactly where the aurochs were from. But yeah, hey presto, they're local animals. We've got dates from them, as you will see, but as I was saying earlier, in terms of how people were living, the presence of these giant animals gave us an insight into the fact that there probably were potentially hundreds of people at Blick Mead at certain points in the year. And why were they there? Well, a lot of them would have been involved in hunting these monster animals, and you would have had to have been very bright and strategic to get them. You'd have needed sharp eyes. You probably would have had to have involved the whole community, from children who've got the sharpest eyes and might be very good at lookouts, to elderly people who might well know where they were better than most. So the hunt would have involved everybody, and it probably would have involved dogs as well, as we'll see later on in the lecture. And then, of course, there's opportunity for all those people to come together for feasting. Now, it's occurred to us that the feasting activities wouldn't have just been as simple as people having a big meal. We know that population sizes, the sizes for the Mesolithic were very low, although I think not as low as the 5,000 estimate I mentioned earlier. But this is an opportunity for people to be in a bigger gene pool, isn't it? When you've got people coming in from all over the place to be involved in the hunt and the food. So we think it might well be, you know, in some ways equivalent of a spring break in Florida, where you get youngsters getting together, you know, potentially producing children on the back of it. There probably were marriage alliances made, families coming through it, and people coming back to the place time and time again because of that. I should say that we dated one of the teeth, as you can see, that tooth comes through 5845 to 5678 BC. So this is over the time, really interesting date, this one. This is around the time, folks, that Britain becomes Britain. Do remember that Britain was joined to continental Europe up until around 6000 BC, and then it steadily becomes an island because of global warming and the sea levels going up. So this was, in effect, the original geological Brexit. Now, this is a suite of radiocarbon dates we've gone from the site. I'm sorry that this is a lot of information. I'm really glad that Smitty is recording this lecture, because you've got a chance of looking at this again at your leisure later on. But if I can just encourage you to look at the far right-hand column and cast your eyes down to the bottom of it, what we've got here is something amazing, frankly, and it is evidence that people are at Blick Mead from around 8000 BC all the way down to, in fact, the middle Neolithic, around 3500 BC. So funnily enough, around the time of the building of the cursus. Now, there is nothing like this, everyone, in the whole of Europe for a Mesolithic site. Nothing like it. And it breaks the stereotype of Mesolithic sites being characterized as being very temporary, and, you know, people sort of setting up camp in search of the latest big herd of animals. So people seem to be coming to this place again and again and again. And partly it might be because of the hunting and the feasting. It might be that there are memories attached to this, and, you know, people are it's ritualized. I'm going to be coming up with some more ideas and more detail as the lecture progresses. Now, one of the excitements for me about the dates is that for the first time we can make sense of these enigmatic Mesolithic dated post holes found underneath the old Stonehenge car park on the Stonehenge Knoll. Now, these were found in the late 1960s, and at the time, right the way through to the full discovery of Blick Mead, they were almost a type of embarrassment to English heritage, because, as I was saying earlier, and as Tim Darville's quote shows, there was just no other evidence really of Mesolithic occupation in the landscape. So people couldn't understand why these things, which are unique for northwestern Europe, were there. Well, now we have direct correlation between the dates from Blick Mead and these posts going in. So basically, it almost certainly is the case that people who are living at Blick Mead put them up. Some of you might well be thinking, well, why were they there? You know, this is very strange that Stonehenge ends up getting built on the same knoll in the 4th millennium BC, so thousands of years later. It's like a massive coincidence that these early monuments are there. Why are they there? What's it all about? I'll give you hopefully some ideas later on. Now, who did the building? As I say, I'm saying it's people from Blick Mead, but thanks to the Natural History Museum, some of you may have seen the documentary about this on PBS fairly recently. We now have an idea of what people look like, and this is really interesting. So the Natural History Museum's analysis of so-called Cheddar Man, this is a guy who lived in the village of Cheddar, which is in Somerset, about 3 hours downriver to Blick Mead. And we know that people from Cheddar visited the site because they have some very characteristic tools made out of limestone from that area. So I think we can reasonably say that we have people from Cheddar coming to Blick Mead. Yeah, and so Natural History Museum's analysis of his DNA suggests he's essentially black, but with blue eyes. And you know, I think he would, you know, essentially look very Aboriginal, sort of Australian Aboriginal in look. And so that's something that's very interesting to me, because we know from early Neolithic DNA that people's skin type was different. In fact, it looked more Asian. So we really only get white genes coming in, as I'm sure some of you know, in the Beaker period. So it is interesting to think about the fact that people didn't look stereotypically like white people looked like at the time. Those of you interested to know more about this, I've included a link to the Natural History Museum site, so you can check it out for yourselves. Now, I was just saying, why are those posts there? This is a LiDAR image here, and I've type of jotted down where those Mesolithic posts are. They're sort of going east-west. And this is something I can really recommend everybody to do. It costs absolutely nothing. It's just literally me walking around the landscape, being aware of the humps and bumps of the natural topography. And something that I realized when I was walking around the perimeter of Stonehenge was that there are these little traces of ancient river channels, paleo channels. And I realized, actually, David, I thought to myself, well, look, these are sort of funneling in here. I don't know if you can see these yourselves, funneling in. And then I was really sort of quite excited to realize that they came out of an old river channel, a much bigger one, which is known as Stonehenge Bottom. This was what's called in English a winterbourne up until quite recently. So a winterbourne means it floods in the winter. And there's a natural fording point here as well. Now, in the UK, we are bad at factoring animals into landscapes. In America, you're so much better at doing that. I think it might be because you've got hunting tradition carrying on into the present. But like I say, we haven't, and you know, as a result, we've got a blind spot. What I did was I thought, well, actually, how does all this work if you put animals into it? And it occurred to me, hang on a minute, you've got a natural kill zone here. You've got side funnels that are channeling animal movement into these funnels. And so actually people that know this have got an advantage when it comes to hunting the animals. And that took me back to the Mesolithic posts. I wonder if they are markers for large herbivore movements, and that people up on the ridges could signal where the animals were at a given point and then could ambush them. It's just a thought, but if I'm right, this would give one of the earliest meanings to the Stonehenge landscape, that originally it was a place for major hunts, really spectacular ones that might have become increasingly ceremonialized and mythologized over time. It's interesting to me that the cursors, and you can see it in the top left of the screen, that the cursors actually seems to me to be following that not quite east-west alignment that I'm suggesting for the Side Valley funnel. Now that's built quite a bit later in 3500 BC, but I'm wondering if the cursus is built. No one knows to this day why it was built, but I'm wondering if it's built as a way of marking out the domestication of an earlier wild place that was associated with the hunt. That as Neolithic farmers went in and started farming the lands, they may well have been marking up the landscape to show that there weren't many wild animals around anymore. You certainly wouldn't want an Aurochs crashing in on your domesticated cow herd, because they'd cause an awful lot of damage. Now, I was mentioning about latest discoveries. This is only a few days old. It went out on the BBC website 4 days ago, and I'm really excited about it. Up on a ridge, if I just take you back to the previous slide, there is a ridge just outside the right-hand side of this image. It's called King Barrow Ridge. Now, on King Barrow Ridge, a team from the University of Birmingham have just discovered or just published the discovery of a massive, very early dated Mesolithic pit. And they are describing it as a hunting pit. Now, it seems to me this fits rather nicely with my theory. I hope I don't sound immodest. I think I'm reasonably, I think if you do archaeology properly, you're constantly challenged by how many times you're wrong. And so I think that's good. It keeps you honest. But once in a while, occasionally, you have an idea that could be onto something. I think this is really gratifying for me because I published about that conjecture about the Aurochs hunting grounds in 2018. And hey presto, 4 years later, it looks like that's got a bit of data to add to that. This is a picture of King Barrow Ridge, where the guy's standing. You can see from this brilliant picture how Stonehenge is on a knoll. It's on a sort of raised bit but surrounded by ridges. Now, because archaeologists have been so understandably focused on the stones and the upstanding monuments in the World Heritage Site, I don't think that they've thought very much at all about animals and the people before. Now, if you take Stonehenge out of it, and we've also got evidence, by the way, that this was deforested in the Mesolithic, what you got here potentially is a sort of equivalent of the Serengeti, with ridges which are very good places for people to chart the movement of big animals and take them down. It's only a thought, but I think it's gaining some credibility. Where's the evidence for people coming from elsewhere? Well, we've got artifacts that suggest that. I've already mentioned about the limestone tool and Cheddar Man. The slate tool, we've subjected that to petrochemical analysis, and the slate can only have come from North Wales or North Cornwall. So for those of you not so au fait with the UK, Wales is to the west of Great Britain, and Cornwall is right on the edge, its most westernmost outpost. Either way, this piece of slate has come a long way to Blick Mead. And what's really fascinating about the shape of it here is that it's very indicative of a tool from the Sussex Weald called a Horsham point. So I think this is a really important discovery. It's it's potentially a moment when people from Sussex are communicating with people from Wales or Cornwall and showing them how to make something on a piece of slate. And then that is put into this special spring. Something else which is special, it's a unique object for the British Mesolithic, is this sandstone artifact, and that comes from the West Midlands. And finally, I mentioned earlier about the possibility of dogs being involved on the hunt. You'll understand that domesticated dogs are way rarer at this time than wolves. And obviously the domesticated dogs had been bred from wolves. So this dog is a proper dog, and the DNA analysis and the isotopic analysis, especially which was undertaken by Durham University, the isotopic analysis suggests it came way to the north of Blick Mead, possibly as far as the Vale of York, but much more likely to be to the east of that. So the dog is coming a distance too. So all in all, we've got these fragments of evidence which are suggesting people are coming into the site from a long way away. But hitherto, I haven't actually shown you where people were living at Blick Mead. We've got this amazing spring full of archaeology, but no evidence of where people were working. So I've worked closely again with Ludwig Boltzmann Institute, which is based is part of Vienna University, and the wonderful geophysics team from the Stonehenge Landscapes project. You can see I'm standing nearest the camera, and I'm actually standing at the edge of the spring. Where the stripped area is a terrace, and this is where we were hoping we might find where people were living. And the geophysical survey of that terrace, if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you can see about 2 meters down there is a red circle, and that denoted an area of interest. And amazingly, that area of interest revealed by the geophysics, that's a long way down for it to pick up on this, has come up trumps, and it's resulted in the only Mesolithic occupation area found so far in the Stonehenge World Heritage Sites. So we've got evidence of a wall, a couple of post holes, a very big fire, and a huge amount of very, very tiny tools. 2p pieces are not very big in the UK, the size of a large button. So quite why people are making tools of this tiny dimension, we're not sure. We think possibly, as these are all very late Mesolithic, that it might be that it's children learning how to make tools, and possibly as they're making them, they're being encultured more deeply in the ways of the Mesolithic. You know, actually, for people who can't read and write, physicalizing narratives is a really good way of remembering. And so actually perhaps that is what's going on here. But this was a thrill for us. Of course, the big deal was, what were the dates going to be for this occupation area? And so this is where our fundraising efforts really came in trumps, because individuals or groups paid for carbon dates, and which is wonderful because I've been able to list them in our publications. But look at this suite of dates coming up now, everyone. Nothing like it in Great Britain for a Mesolithic site. I'm going to run through 5 dates. Now, the first one is 4,336 to 4,246 BC. Now, that was startling when I saw that come through. Why? Well, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, the received wisdom had been that the Mesolithic pretty much was gone by 4,500 BC in the UK. And that was a real pity, because we knew much more confidently that the first Neolithic farmers coming in from the continent didn't get to, came over to Britain around 4000 BC. So there was a sort of 500-year gap between the last hunter-gatherers and the first farmers. Well, here we had a date that was potentially starting to provide the sort of northwest passage between the Neolithic and the Mesolithic, which memorably was summed up to me by a professor who came to the site. He said the Mesolithic is from Mars and the Neolithic is from Venus. Well, as you're going to see from the carbon dates, no more is that the case. So the next date came through, even more interesting. This is actually from the ground surface that people would have walked on. That came through at 4,340 BC to 4,232 BC. So if anything, we were getting earlier. Next date was earlier, right on the doorstep, look, of 4,000 BC, 4236 to more or less 4,000 BC. Now, this was a really important date, along with the other ones, because it chimes with the earliest Neolithic dates we have in the Stonehenge landscape. Now, why is that important? Well, I'm sure, you know, your minds are racing round about this already. Well, potentially it shows hunter-gatherers living side by side with the first farmers. And it's likely, and we're going to see evidence for this in a minute, that families came out of that contact. Just as you get in the pioneer period in the US, where you get small numbers of farmers coming from Europe and pushing out into the west of America, and often being in the minority in terms of the native population, but at points, families coming through those, the connect between the two different groups of people. Well, that's what I think might be coming here. And finally, another date that takes us very close to 4000 BC from the interior of the occupation shelter. So as I say, earliest date that we've got from the Neolithic is actually found underneath this sarsen stone, stone 28. And that date, as you can see, nicely covers that date range. that we were getting from Blick Mead. Now, again, poor old Tim Darville, who is getting a bit of a hammering in this lecture, and I don't mean to give him a hammering because he was writing before Blick Mead was discovered. Darville said in his, at the time, landmark book, this date was, quote, indicative of pre-henge activity that's otherwise invisible. Well, everyone, you can see it's certainly not invisible anymore. Another big question for us. Yep, we got the occupation area, very late Mesolithic. And we've got the spring, which is full of archaeology and got wonderful dates. But what was on the, what actually, if anything, was in the overlap between where the occupation area was and the wet. And again, we brought in a geophysics team here, and we weren't expecting this. If you have a look at that image, you can see a sinuous black line broadly running north to south, or south to north. That was very unexpected because the geophysics were picking up a stone feature. So we put a trench in, and as we were going down on it, to our amazement, we started to encounter a laid platform, a stone surface. Here it is, a nice section of it. Now, this is, again, something that's unique for Europe. And again, it also challenges stereotypes about hunter-gatherers, I think, worldwide, because they're seen as people who are very mobile, and they're not really setting up permanent settlements. Well, you can't get a more permanent fabric than stone. Remember, people here could have easily built this surface out of wood, but they're putting in something pretty permanent. So we were very excited to date this. Now, early indications are from the surface that the date, at least on the surface, is very like the occupation area that I've just shown you. But actually in the surface, we've got a much earlier date, and you'll see we have another one that chimes with it from the 7th millennium BC. So this is really interesting. It looks like we've got a consolidated set of platforms that are, so in other words, it's a platform that's regularly being mended or type of bulked up. And people are deliberately selecting stones that are similar size to make it over a very long period of time. Here's another date that we've got from it. This is from an Aurochs heel that was embedded in the surface. So this comes out again in as a 7th millennium BC date. Fascinating. Now, in the last dig in October, we stripped back part of that platform and found some astonishing things. Nearest to you, this big splodgy looking thing that might not look much is a gigantic Aurochs sort of hoof print or hoof prints. Amazing that this was so well preserved. And then you'll see to the right, there seems to be some sort of semicircular arrangement of stones. We're wondering if these may have been attached to some sort of fishing net, but they've laid in situ, in place, for thousands of years. And if this wasn't amazing enough, look at this. What you've just seen there, everybody, is incredibly well-preserved Aurochs hoof prints. Can you see the outline here? You can even see that, I think you can see the line of a particular hoof print, and here as well, and here as well. Nothing like this found, as I was saying before, anywhere in Europe outside of a coastal area. Now, why and how has that survived? I mean, coastal areas are one thing. Obviously, you get sea coming back in and filling holes like this full of silt. But, you know, the spring isn't tidal. So my running conjecture is that, in fact, that the platform surface originally is being deliberately placed on top of the hoof prints in order to memorialize them, you know, in order to record the fact that they were there. And I think this begins to make better sense if we look at ethnographic evidence, where we can see that hunter-gatherer groups across the world, including your country, are worshipping, using religious forms like animism and totemism. And so I suppose simply put, that means that people are seeing they're very much worshipping animals, to the extent that something like this, they may see that the animal, if you're capturing the animal in some way and memorializing it, that you're, in some sense, the qualities of that animal are being imbued, say in this case, in the platform surface. I suppose another way of looking at or explaining it is to think of what happens in European cathedrals in the Middle Ages, where saints' relics are often put in the cathedrals. And these aren't just touristic things, there would be particular associations with particular saints, and they would be seen as being part of the fabric of particular buildings. And I think something like that is going on here. This was an amazing find, I have to say. So I think what we can say is that something like this must have been happening at Blick Mead. And of course, these are water buffalo, wonderful picture taken in South Africa. But we've got evidence really of these large animals probably trudging along the spring line, drinking water, and they would have needed gallons of water, and eating the grass that was growing alongside the spring. Now, very recently, Southampton University have been involved in constructing how the Blick Mead area looked, and they're taking as a baseline from about 6000 BC. Now, the blue area that you can see here is their estimate as to how long the River Avon, how big the River Avon was, and they're guessing it's about 90 meters wide. Now it's very tidied up and sort of picturesque, but this would have been much more like the sort of Zambezi or something, a much wilder, harder river to tame. And they situate Blick Mead as almost like a type of little, in a type of little protected nook. Blick Mead is here, and it would have been almost like a little B road coming off the big river, a place that people could be bringing their logboats to and disembarking from. And in fact, one of my PhD students made a Mesolithic longboat, as you can see in the right-hand corner. Do you know something I found really fascinating about it? I was very keen on these two elderly gentlemen to be the first pilots, if you like, of the boat. There was many a health and safety scare, ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you. But I was interested because I thought, as I was sort of touching on earlier, I think the elderly in hunter-gatherer culture are actually far more respected than elderly people are now in our culture. These are people that would have known where the resources were. Let's remember that. And actually, for them, getting around in boats is a damn sight better than going around in electric wheelchairs or wheelchairs. And they would have a degree of agency, and a degree of usefulness, which probably would have made their lives better. So both of these guys have been a major help on the site before. Site custodian Mike Clark, who's at the front of the boat in particular. So people like this is another example of a spin-off from our discoveries of Blick Mead, type of thinking out of the box in a way that can actually inform on our way we live our lives now. So other material, thank you for being so, I know this is quite a data-rich lecture, but I really wanted to give you all the stuff that's just come through. Results from the University of Southampton and Tromsø University from Norway show that Blick Mead was around 6000 BC, was actually cleared, and this is really exciting. Again, not the sort of thing you would expect from hunter-gatherers. And there's even evidence of potential manuring, that people were deliberately type of mashing up Aurochs poo, particularly, to increase the growth rates of the ground. And the Southampton team have identified 43 different species of pollen, including things like roses and apple trees, also including, fascinatingly, plants like henbane, which of course produce psychotropic experiences and may well have been those sorts of things being used in religious rites. We've also got some really important dates from Tromsø University, which not only date the platform or the type of latest phase of it again to the late Mesolithic, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, around 4,500 BC, but rather marvelously date the whole sequence of the terrace. So the dates you can see in front of you there's one of them from the Middle Bronze Age. The higher date is from the Roman period. And what this shows is that this part of the site is continually used by people. In fact, the latest date from it is from the High Medieval period. So this has been a place that's continually been used in Britain from the end of the Ice Age, and actually as such, it is a unique place in British history. Here are extra details about those dates. So you can see at the bottom the medieval ones there. Okay, let's start to wind up the lecture now and just establish the landscape again. You can see where Blick Mead is, you can see where Stonehenge is, etc. I wanted to bring in some latest research as well, which is showing potentially that hunter-gatherers are still persisting a little bit further into the Neolithic in the area around Conabry. Now, so the Conabry so-called anomaly, I've marked there with a blue X. It's about 1.5 miles from Blick Mead, up on a ridge. It's interesting position. If you looked eastwards, you'd see Blick Mead. If you look westwards from the anomaly, you'd see the future site of Stonehenge. It dates to 3,750 BC, and it's been seen as the earliest Neolithic place in the Stonehenge landscape. What's really fascinating about it is what's in this big pit that gives the anomaly its name. And it's a really interesting mixture of farmer artifacts like domestic wheat and barley, domestic cattle bone, and early Neolithic pottery, with about loads of wild animal bone, and also some later Mesolithic flint tool starts. And what it points to, I think, is there being, at the minimum, a sort of celebration, a memory, if you like, of hunter-gatherer and farmer groups getting on well in this landscape. I mean, it could be that they're marking the appropriation, perhaps, of hunter-gatherer culture, but that is being done, I think, very respectfully here. And this would have been, there's major amounts of feasting going on around the anomaly. It would have been a high-profile event that would have lasted months. So I think this is significant, and it's in a significant place in the landscape, as I say, overlooking the future site of Stonehenge in one direction and Blick Mead in another. And there might well be, very understandably, people listening to this thinking, hang on a minute, my God, these dates are so, wide of each other. Conabry anomaly is 3,750 BC. Stonehenge isn't started to be built until around 3,000 BC. 750 years is a massive amount of time. Well, what I'd say back to that is that the Conabry henge is about 1,000, was constructed about 1,000 years later than the anomaly. There wouldn't have been any trace of the anomaly 1,000 years on, and yet it was built very near to that pit. And that does suggest, as I said before, very long memories in this landscape. Okay, we're coming to Stonehenge now. I'm just going to quickly check the time. I don't want to, I appreciate I'm running over just slightly, but I'm nearly finished. Just wanted to give you some detail about Stonehenge. Phase 1 is 3,000 BC. We all know that. But what people haven't done, again, they haven't looked at the animals. And I've really been interested in the animals that were placed in the foundation ditch, which is the earliest part of Stonehenge. And I'm wondering, rather than just describing the animals in there, that we should be thinking about the symbolism. So, for example, there's an Auroch skull in the southwestern entrance. In the southern entrance, there's 2 cow jaws either side of the terminus points facing each other. It would have almost been like, as you walked into the henge, from that direction that you're entering into a mouth. In the famous northeast entrance point, either side of the terminus points, you've got horns, you've got antlers, and you've also got teeth as well from Aurochs. So it looks to me as though maybe the symbolism here is that we've got animism going on. We've got the original part of Stonehenge is to do with animals, and it's to do with entering into a sacred space, maybe going over a threshold, which are sort of guarded, like the northeast entrance, by quite hostile animal body parts. And as I was saying earlier about the cow jaws, you're actually going into a mouth in effect. So my sense here is that the earliest construction of Stonehenge is looking back as well as looking forward. It's looking back to wild animals and the hunt, and it's looking also at domestication too. So in some ways, especially with it being circular, it's quite harmonious. It could be something to do with bringing two cultures together in its earliest form. And if I'm right about these long memories, that might explain why at Blick Mead, at the time of Stonehenge in its heyday, why we're finding these very, very high quality ritual objects at Blick Mead. So the arrowhead on the right-hand side would have been useless as an arrowhead, but it's an absolutely exquisite piece of work. I mean, it's like a piece of art. You only find them at special henge sites. So the find of this at Blick Mead is marking it out as, I'd argue, special around 2,500 BC as well. It's part of the liturgical arrangement at Stonehenge. Now, we've got all this great information, folks, all this new stuff about our wonderful World Heritage Site. And I say our, it's yours as well. It's the world's. That's why it's a World Heritage Site. But our government has been attempting to bulldoze literally through UNESCO's rules and advice by saying that they want to build a tunnel and a flyover through the World Heritage Site. Now, last summer, I've been the archaeologist that has been leading the archaeology team against the tunnel happening, along with Professor Mike Parker Pearson. And we thought we'd won, because the High Court in the UK said that the government had acted unlawfully. But actually, we're in a situation now where Boris Johnson and his cabinet are ruminating on completely disregarding the High Court's decision and building the thing anyway. So this is a picture of me coming away from Parliament, trying to make the case, and just as it happens, Boris Johnson was on his way into Parliament. You can see, folks, that British security may not be quite what it ought to be, the fact that we're so close together. But in a way, this picture does sum up. Is it going to be BJ or DJ that wins? I think in this case, we're hoping it's us. The more data we can produce from the site, the better it is, we hope. As a my final slide, and as a sign of why, we really need to be thinking about the protection of the World Heritage Site as much as possible before we put things like tunnels through it, is that on the very last 2 hours of our last excavation, we found an earlier platform. The young lad on the left-hand side is right by the best preserved bit of it. We hardly had time, as you can see, to expose it. It's appreciably lower than the Aurochs hoof prints. So this might be very early indeed. And it just shows that there's all sorts of surprises that come out of this heritage site. Thank you very much for your attention to this lecture, and I'm very happy to take questions.